Yes, we get to this interesting time where the church, God has asked many things of the saints. He's asked them to go settle Zion, Missouri, to purchase properties, to build a temple in Kirtland. And of course, people are trying to manage their lives and farms and relationships. So here we are, 1837. The church is just over 7 years old. Kirtland itself has seen massive growth from about 1,000 inhabitants to, in the 1836, about 3,000 people living there. And what had happened, and this is actually throughout the United States, there had been quite a bit of inflation, a lot of growth. Estimates are that land prices had gone up somewhere like 7 times in Kirtland. So if something cost, say, $7 an acre, that now land was over $40, $45 an acre. And during 1837, those high prices dramatically dropped down to around $17 an acre. And we'll see this all plays out, that where everything became very expensive, suddenly people lost a lot of wealth. And there's all these debts that the church is trying to work with in trying to establish Zion and have the center of the church also in Kirtland. And there is the work of God that needs to be done, and it simply cannot just be done by people feeling the Spirit. That's crucial. But God also has material resources at hand to help the work progress. And we see that Joseph Smith, in addition to being a prophet, in some ways, he feels this need to kind of be the chief executive officer and the treasurer and the banker. And he's using all the best resources in his mind and in society with all the people he can help support him in the cause of Zion. And sometimes mistakes were made. And we'll just point out that when we look at what is called the Kirtland Safety Society, so essentially church leaders decided to create a bank. And with that bank, they printed paper money that people then could share with one another. It turns out that banks offer credit. The word credit means trust. The idea is if I hand you this piece of paper and I say this is worth $100, there's supposed to be a level of trust that it really is worth that much. Well, it turns out there were thousands of banks throughout the United States at this time, often privately created by citizens or communities. And I don't think the saints understood what was going on economically throughout the United States, but there was a massive economic crash in 1837 that contributed to some very serious and significant problems in the church.
So one of the issues here at play is with this major financial difficulty going on, they're thinking, part of the problem is we owe money to so many other people. What if we stopped paying our interest to other people? What if we had our own bank? The problem is, when they went to the legislature of Ohio, of the state of the Ohio at that point, to petition to start a bank, the Ohio legislators weren't approving any new banks, and so they shut down the petition. So they came back to Kirtland and said, well, we don't need their permission. We'll just start a non-bank that functions as this private equity group that will act as if we were a bank, but we're not going to be a bank. That's going to end up getting Joseph and Sidney into some legal problems later on. They weren't lawyers. They didn't know everything they were doing. They're trying to solve these major problems. So January 2nd, 1837 is when they started this Kirtland Safety Society. But as Taylor mentioned, it's only a few months later when it's not just in Kirtland and it's not just in Ohio where financial troubles start peaking. It's in all of the United States at the time.
It's actually one of the worst financial disasters in American history. There are many causes. One of them is Andrew Jackson was very much against the idea that the U.S. government runs a bank that supports other banks. And so he shut down essentially the federal bank. And so it made it so that other banks that were depending on the support of the U.S. bank started to fail. And according to some research, the number of banks that failed in 1837 was a higher percentage than the number of banks that failed in the United States during the Great Depression. Something on the order of either around 47% of the banks failed in the United States in 1837, failed or were partially closed, compared to about 35 to 37% during the Great Depression. And the Great Depression we all know about, but in some ways this was more of a disaster. So historically in the context, what what the church leaders are trying to do is, how do we temporarily provide salvation for the church? But they can't control the larger economy. And
the amazing thing is it was a very easy thing for the enemies of the church to help accelerate the demise of the Kirtland Safety Society, because they start printing all kinds of allegations about the church and their lack of resources, and it causes a run on the bank. That's what causes failures for banks, is when people come and demand their money be given to them that was invested in the bank, and eventually the bank runs out of the capital and the bank fails. And that's what happens in Kirtland. Many people blamed Joseph for all of this. 100% blame on Joseph.
It's interesting that many, many banks failed. And if you look at the legal record, other banks that were in very similar situations to the Kirtland Safety Society were not legally attacked. And yet Joseph was, and the Kirtland Safety Society. So we're not trying to say that what the Kirtland Safety Society did was 100% correct or wise in every way. But it is interesting that the church had enemies, and people pounced on what they saw as a weakness, even though they weren't willing to use that same standard against banks in their own communities.
Yeah, this is a very difficult time.